Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. Now you might be thinking, this is just another conspiracy theory about missing treasure. But what if I told you the real story of the Knights Templar is far more shocking than any Hollywood movie could ever portray? What if their rise to power involved secrets that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous? And what if their destruction wasn't just about greed, but about a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of medieval society? I'm about to take you inside the true story of the Knights Templar, from their mysterious beginnings in the ruins of Solomon's Temple to their final moments on the burning pyre. We'll uncover how 9 broke knights became Europe's first international banking empire, why kings and popes both feared and needed them, and what really happened to their legendary treasure. But most importantly, we'll meet the real people behind the legend. Warriors, bankers, mystics, and martyrs whose choices shaped the course of history. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll understand why the Templar story isn't just medieval history. It's a blueprint for how secret societies operate, how power corrupts, and how myths are born from the ashes of truth. What you're about to discover will completely change how you see medieval Europe, and honestly, it might change how you see the modern world too. But first, let me set the stage with a story that perfectly captures the contradiction at the heart of the Templar legend. It's 1191, and Hugues de Payens stands in the scorching heat outside the walls of Acre. He's not the founder of the Templars anymore. That Hugues de Payens died decades earlier. This is his successor, watching as Templar knights charge into battle alongside Richard the Lionheart. These warriors wear white surcoats emblazoned with red crosses, and they fight with a ferocity that terrifies even battle-hardened Saracens. They've taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They own nothing. They are supposedly humble monks. Yet this same order owns castles across Europe and the Holy Land. They've invented modern banking. Kings borrow money from them. They answer to no earthly authority except the Pope. And in their treasure rooms, they guard secrets that could topple kingdoms. How did 9 broke French knights transform into medieval Europe's most powerful institution? That's where our story really begins. Not with grand battles or dramatic conspiracies, but with something much simpler and infinitely more dangerous. An idea. The year was 1095, and Pope Urban II stood before a massive crowd in Clermont, France. His words that day would launch 1,000 ships and claim millions of lives. God wills it, he declared, calling for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. What followed was the First Crusade, a bloody campaign that would establish crusader states in the Holy Land and create a power vacuum that clever men could exploit. Among those clever men was a French knight named Hugues de Payens. Now here's where the official story gets interesting, because according to Templar chronicles written much later, Hugues and 8 companions approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem in 1119 with a simple request. They wanted to protect pilgrims traveling to the holy sites. The king, apparently impressed by their piety, granted them quarters in his palace, which happened to be built on the site of Solomon's Temple. But here's the first crack in the official narrative. Why would the king give away prime real estate to 9 unknown knights? Why did these supposedly poor monks need such extensive quarters? And most puzzling of all, why did they spend their first 9 years doing absolutely nothing about protecting pilgrims? The truth is far more intriguing than the legend, and it starts with understanding who Hugues de Payens really was. He wasn't just some random knight looking to serve God. He was connected to some of the most powerful families in Europe. His overlord was the Count of Champagne, who happened to be one of the wealthiest men in France and a key financier of the First Crusade. Even more interesting, Hugues was related by marriage to Bernard of Clairvaux, who would later become Saint Bernard, one of the most influential religious figures of the medieval period. These weren't random connections. In medieval Europe, everything was about networks, alliances, and carefully orchestrated power plays. When Hugues de Payens arrived in Jerusalem, he wasn't just another knight seeking salvation. He was the advance guard of a much larger plan. But what was that plan? To understand it, we need to look at what was happening beneath their feet in those first mysterious 9 years. The site of Solomon's Temple wasn't just symbolically important. According to both Jewish and Islamic tradition, it had been the center of immense wealth and power. The original temple, built by King Solomon, had supposedly housed the Ark of the Covenant and treasures beyond imagination. Even after its destruction and rebuilding, the site remained significant. The Second Temple, destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, had been the center of Jewish religious and economic life. Now, what do you do if you're 9 ambitious knights with powerful connections and you've been given exclusive access to dig around one of the most legendary sites in the ancient world? You start digging. And dig they did. Archaeological evidence from the 19th century, when British explorers gained access to the area beneath the Temple Mount, revealed extensive tunnel systems, some clearly medieval in origin. Tools, pottery shards, and other artifacts suggested intensive excavation work during exactly the period when the Templars had exclusive access to the site. What were they looking for? The obvious answer is treasure, but that's thinking too small. These men were playing a much more sophisticated game. Consider this. In medieval Europe, legitimacy came from 2 sources: divine approval and ancient authority. If you could claim to possess artifacts or knowledge from Solomon's temple, you weren't just rich, you were blessed by God himself. You had a direct connection to the source of wisdom and power that built the greatest temple in history. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because while the Templars were supposedly digging in secret, they were simultaneously building one of the most sophisticated PR campaigns in medieval history. And the architect of this campaign was none other than Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a master of medieval media. He wrote letters, delivered sermons, and crafted theological arguments that spread across Europe faster than any news network. In 1128, nearly a decade after the Templars' formation, Bernard penned a document called In Praise of the New Knighthood. This wasn't just an endorsement. It was a revolutionary manifesto that solved one of medieval Christianity's biggest contradictions. The problem was this: Christianity preached peace, love, and turning the other cheek. But the Crusades required violence, warfare, and killing. How do you reconcile being a Christian with being a warrior? Bernard's answer was brilliant in its simplicity. The Templars, he argued, weren't just knights. They were warrior monks, fighting not for earthly gain, but for heavenly reward. When they killed in battle, they weren't committing murder, they were performing a holy sacrament. He even coined a term for it: malicide, the killing of evil. This theological innovation didn't just justify the Templars' existence, it made them indispensable. Suddenly, every Christian king needed warrior monks who could fight without compromising their souls. Every noble family wanted sons who could pursue military glory while still earning their way into heaven. But Bernard's masterstroke went even deeper. In his writings, he hinted at mysteries, at secret knowledge, at divine revelations that the Templars had supposedly discovered. He never said exactly what these secrets were, but he made it clear that the Templars possessed something extraordinary, something that elevated them above ordinary knights and even ordinary monks. This combination of military prowess, religious authority, and mysterious knowledge proved irresistible to medieval Europe's power brokers. Donations poured in from across the continent. Land, money, weapons, horses, entire estates were gifted to the order. Within decades, the Templars had transformed from 9 knights sharing quarters to an international organisation with thousands of members and properties stretching from Scotland to Cyprus. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because success brought scrutiny, and scrutiny revealed contradictions that would eventually destroy them. Take their famous vow of poverty, for instance. Individual Templars owned nothing, but the order itself became fabulously wealthy. They developed innovative financial instruments that allowed pilgrims and crusaders to deposit money in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land, effectively inventing modern banking. They charged fees for these services, of course, and those fees added up quickly. Their vow of obedience was equally complex. They answered only to the Pope, which meant they were effectively above the law in every kingdom where they operated. Kings couldn't tax them, local bishops couldn't control them, and civil authorities couldn't prosecute them. They had become a state within every state, and their vow of chastity, well, that one would come back to haunt them in the most spectacular way possible. The Templars' rise coincided with one of medieval Europe's most transformative periods. The 12th century saw the birth of universities, the revival of classical learning, and the emergence of new forms of spirituality that challenged traditional religious authority. Into this intellectual ferment, the Templars brought something unprecedented, an organization that combined military power, financial expertise, and claims to divine revelation. They weren't just participants in this transformation, they were architects of it. Their commanderies became centers of learning and innovation. Their financial networks facilitated trade across vast distances. Their military expertise influenced warfare throughout Europe and the Middle East. But with great power comes great enemies, and by the 13th century, the Templars had accumulated plenty of both. The most dangerous enemy wasn't who you'd expect. It wasn't the Saracens they fought in the Holy Land, or rival military orders like the Hospitallers. It was a man who owed them everything. Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair. Picture Philip in 1305, pacing the halls of his palace at Fontainebleau. He's got the kind of problem that keeps kings awake at night. His treasury is empty. His wars with England have drained the royal coffers. His attempts to debase the currency have triggered riots in Paris. And sitting just outside the city walls is the Paris Temple, the Templars' European headquarters, containing more wealth than the royal treasury could ever hope to match. But Philip's problem with the Templars went deeper than mere envy. These warrior monks had become a parallel power structure that threatened the very concept of royal authority. When Philip tried to tax the church, the Templars claimed exemption. When he attempted to regulate banking, they operated under papal protection. When he needed loans, they set the terms. He was supposed to be the most powerful man in France, yet 9 men in white robes could tell him no. The breaking point came in 1306, when Philip attempted one of medieval Europe's most audacious financial schemes. Desperate for revenue, he ordered the expulsion of all Jews from France and the confiscation of their property. It was ethnic cleansing disguised as economic policy, and it should have solved his money problems overnight. But here's what Philip hadn't counted on. The Templars had been the Jews' bankers and protectors. When the royal soldiers arrived to seize Jewish assets, they found that most of the wealth had already been transferred to Templar accounts, protected by papal bulls that even kings couldn't override. Philip had been outmaneuvered by monks, and everyone knew it. His authority was crumbling, his enemies were laughing, and his creditors were circling like vultures. He needed a victory, and he needed it to be spectacular. That's when he turned to a man whose name has become synonymous with medieval corruption, Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's chief minister and the medieval equivalent of a political hitman. Nogaret had already orchestrated one of the most shocking events of the 13th century when he physically attacked Pope Boniface VIII at Anagni, leading to the Pope's death shortly after. If anyone could destroy the Templars, it was Nogaret. But Nogaret faced a seemingly impossible challenge. How do you bring down an organization protected by papal authority, backed by immense wealth, and trained in the arts of war? His solution was brilliant in its cynicism. You don't attack their strengths, you attack their secrets. Because here's what Nogaret understood that modern conspiracy theorists often miss. The Templars' real vulnerability wasn't their treasure or their power. It was the gap between their public image and their private reality. For 2 centuries, they had cultivated an image of perfect Christian knighthood while operating as a secretive international organization with its own rules, rituals, and loyalties. All Nogaret needed to do was exploit that contradiction. The first crack appeared in the form of a disgraced former Templar named Escuin de Floyran. In 1305, this man approached both Philip and James II of Aragon with explosive allegations about Templar initiation ceremonies. According to Escuin, new members were required to deny Christ, spit on the cross, and engage in homosexual acts with their superiors. He claimed the Templars worshipped a mysterious idol called Baphomet, and that their secret rituals mocked everything Christianity held sacred. Now, were these allegations true? That's the wrong question. The right question is, were they believable? And in the fevered religious atmosphere of medieval Europe, they absolutely were. Think about it from a 14th century perspective. The Templars operated in secret. They had strange rituals that outsiders never witnessed. They claimed to possess divine knowledge that they shared with no one. They had grown rich while other Christians suffered. And most damning of all, they had ultimately failed in their primary mission. The Holy Land was back in Muslim hands. Jerusalem was lost, and the Crusades were over. To medieval minds, there could be only one explanation for such failure, despite such apparent divine favor. The Templars had made a deal with the devil. Nogaret didn't need to prove the allegations were true. He just needed to make them stick long enough to destroy the order and seize its assets. And he had the perfect tool for the job, the Inquisition. The Inquisition wasn't just a religious court, it was a legal system specifically designed to extract confessions through torture and terror. Inquisitors operated under the assumption that anyone accused was probably guilty, and they had refined the art of breaking human will to a medieval science. Best of all, from Philip's perspective, inquisitorial proceedings were conducted in secret, which meant he could control the narrative from beginning to end. But even with all these advantages, Nogaret faced one massive obstacle: Pope Clement V. The Templars answered directly to the Pope, and any move against them would require papal approval. Clement, however, was not exactly an independent actor. He was French, he had been elected with Philip's support, and he had already moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon, effectively making himself Philip's prisoner. Still, dissolving a military order that had served the Church for 2 centuries would require careful justification. That justification came in the form of what can only be described as medieval fake news. Throughout 1306 and early 1307, rumours about Templar corruption began circulating across France. These weren't random gossip. They were carefully crafted stories, planted by Nogaret's agents and spread through networks of royal supporters. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling. Templars denying Christ, Templars practicing sodomy, Templars worshipping demons, Templars plotting against Christian kingdoms. By the summer of 1307, public opinion had been thoroughly poisoned against the order. Philip had his justification, Nogaret had his legal framework, and Pope Clement had been maneuvered into a position where opposing the investigation would make him look like he was protecting heretics. All that remained was the execution. The operation that unfolded on October 13th, 1307, was a masterpiece of medieval logistics. Sealed orders were distributed to royal agents across France weeks in advance. Local authorities were briefed on their targets but told nothing about the timing. Soldiers were positioned near every Templar property from Paris to Provence, and at dawn on Friday the 13th, the hammer fell simultaneously across the entire kingdom. The Templars, despite all their military training and political sophistication, were caught completely off guard. Most were arrested in their beds. Those who tried to resist were overwhelmed by superior numbers. By sunset, virtually every Templar in France was in chains, and their property was under royal control. But here's the detail that would fuel conspiracy theories for centuries. When the royal agents inventoried the seized property, they found far less treasure than anyone expected. The Paris Temple, which should have contained the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries, yielded only modest amounts of gold and silver. The legendary Templar treasure had seemingly vanished overnight. Where did it go? The simple answer might be that it was never as vast as legend suggested. Medieval wealth was often tied up in land, buildings, and trading rights, rather than portable treasure. But that explanation has never satisfied those who see conspiracy everywhere. What we do know is that some Templars escaped the initial raids. The Order's fleet, based at La Rochelle, disappeared completely. Several high-ranking Templars, including the Order's treasurer, were never captured, and in the months before the arrests, there were reports of unusual activity at Templar sites across Europe. Wagons moving at night, ships departing with mysterious cargo, coded messages passing between commanderies. Were these the actions of guilty men destroying evidence, or was something else happening? To understand that, we need to look at what happened after the arrests, because the real drama was just beginning. The Templar trials that followed would become one of the most controversial legal proceedings in medieval history. Under torture, many Templars confessed to the charges against them. They admitted to denying Christ, spitting on the cross, and engaging in homosexual acts. These confessions seem to validate Philip's accusations and justify his actions. But here's what makes the trials so problematic. The confessions were wildly inconsistent. Some Templars described rituals that others had never heard of. The supposed idol Baphomet was described differently by different witnesses. And most tellingly, when Templars were removed from royal custody and questioned by papal investigators, many recanted their confessions, claiming they had lied under torture to stop the pain. The most dramatic recantation came from Jacques de Molay himself, the last Grand Master of the Order. Initially, he had confessed under torture and urged other Templars to do the same. But in 1314, when he was brought before Notre Dame Cathedral for his final sentencing, something extraordinary happened. Picture the scene. Thousands of Parisians gathered in the square, expecting to witness the Grand Master's final humiliation. Philip's representatives were there to read the sentence of life imprisonment. Church officials were present to receive de Molay's final submission. Everything was choreographed to demonstrate the complete defeat of the Templar Order. Instead, Jacques de Molay stepped forward and declared that everything he had confessed was a lie. The charges were false, the Order was innocent, and he would rather die than live with the shame of his coerced confession. It was an act of defiance that stunned everyone present and threw Philip's carefully orchestrated proceedings into chaos. De Molay's rebellion had an immediate consequence. That same evening, Philip ordered him burned at the stake as a relapsed heretic. But the Grand Master's final words would echo through history and fuel legends that persist to this day. Standing in the flames on a small island in the Seine River, Jacques de Molay reportedly called upon God to judge between the Templars and their accusers. He summoned both Pope Clement and King Philip to meet him before God's tribunal within a year. Whether he actually said these words or whether they were added later by sympathetic chroniclers, the effect was electrifying. Because within months, both Pope Clement and King Philip were dead, and Philip's royal line would end within a generation, exactly as the curse supposedly predicted. But here's where the story gets even stranger. because the aftermath of the Templar trials reveals just how complex and contradictory this whole affair really was. While Jacques de Molay was burning on that island in the Seine, something remarkable was happening across the rest of Europe. Most other kingdoms were refusing to follow Philip's lead. In England, King Edward II initially arrested the Templars, but the investigations dragged on for years with minimal use of torture. Most English Templars were eventually pensioned off and allowed to join other religious orders. In Germany, the Templars successfully defended themselves in open court, with many being acquitted entirely. In Portugal, the order was simply renamed the Order of Christ and continued operating under royal protection. Even in Spain, most Templars were absorbed into other military orders rather than executed. This wasn't some coordinated resistance to Philip's actions. These kingdoms had their own reasons for protecting, or at least not destroying, their local Templars. The English crown owed massive debts to the Templars and needed their financial networks intact. The German princes valued the Templars' military expertise in their ongoing conflicts with Eastern European pagans. The Iberian kingdoms were still fighting their own crusades against Muslim territories and couldn't afford to lose experienced warrior monks. What this tells us is that the charges against the Templars were never really about heresy or corruption. They were about power, money, and Philip's desperate need to solve his political problems. The religious accusations were just the medieval equivalent of a pretext for regime change. But let's dig deeper into what was actually happening during those mysterious initiation ceremonies that formed the basis of the charges. Because when you strip away the hysteria and propaganda, a fascinating picture emerges of an organization that was far more complex than either its supporters or enemies wanted to admit. The Templars operated what historians now recognize as one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated intelligence networks. Think about their position. They had properties in every major kingdom. They facilitated international banking. They maintained diplomatic contacts with Muslim rulers. And they possessed detailed knowledge of trade routes, military capabilities, and political tensions across 3 continents. Their initiation ceremonies, which Philip's prosecutors painted as satanic rituals, were more likely elaborate security checks designed to test loyalty and discretion. New recruits weren't just joining a religious order. They were entering an organization that dealt in state secrets, managed international finances, and operated in some of the most dangerous political environments in the known world. Consider the charge that initiates were required to deny Christ and spit on the cross. In the context of intelligence work, this makes perfect sense. If a Templar was captured by Muslim forces, his captors might demand exactly such a renunciation as proof of conversion to Islam. A knight who had never been asked to perform such acts might break under pressure, but one who had been psychologically prepared for the possibility might be able to comply without losing his faith or betraying his mission. The allegations of homosexual activity during initiation are equally explainable when viewed through a practical lens. Medieval military orders were all-male institutions where physical intimacy between members was both inevitable and potentially problematic. Structured rituals that acknowledged and controlled such relationships would have been a practical necessity, not evidence of systematic corruption. And the mysterious idol Baphomet. The name itself is likely a corruption of Muhammad, and what the Templars may have possessed was not a demonic statue but intelligence materials, captured Islamic texts, diplomatic correspondence, or strategic documents that would have appeared blasphemous to anyone who didn't understand their intelligence value. This interpretation doesn't make the Templars innocent of all charges. It makes them guilty of something potentially more threatening to medieval authority. They were operating as an independent state, with its own foreign policy, its own intelligence service, and its own version of international law. They weren't heretics, they were competitors. The evidence for this lies not in the trial transcripts, which were compromised by torture and political pressure, but in the Templars' actual behavior during their 2 centuries of operation. Look at their military record. They weren't just crusading knights. They were diplomatic intermediaries who negotiated truces with Muslim leaders, exchanged prisoners, and sometimes even fought alongside Saracen forces when it served broader strategic purposes. Their banking operations tell a similar story. The Templars didn't just move money for pilgrims. They financed trade expeditions, underwrote commercial ventures, and maintained financial relationships with Jewish, Muslim, and Christian merchants across the Mediterranean world. They were practicing a form of economic diplomacy that wouldn't look out of place in a modern multinational corporation. Most tellingly, their architectural projects reveal an organization that was thinking in terms of centuries, not decades. The great Templar churches at London, Paris, and Tamar weren't just places of worship. They were statements of permanence, designed to last forever and to serve as centers of power for a global organization that saw itself as transcending the temporary kingdoms of earthly rulers. This is what made them so dangerous to someone like Philip the Fair. The Templars weren't just rich monks who had outlived their usefulness. They were a parallel civilization that operated by different rules and answered to different authorities. In a world where royal power was still fragile and contested, such an organization represented an existential threat. But Philip's victory over the Templars came at a cost that he probably didn't anticipate. By destroying Europe's most sophisticated financial network, he triggered an economic crisis that lasted for decades. The techniques the Templars had developed for moving money safely across vast distances were lost. Their diplomatic contacts in the Islamic world were severed. Their intelligence networks collapsed. More importantly, Philip's methods set a precedent that would haunt European politics for centuries. He had demonstrated that even the most powerful religious organization could be destroyed through a combination of manufactured scandal, legal manipulation, and coordinated propaganda. Future rulers would remember this lesson and apply it to their own inconvenient opponents. The immediate aftermath of the Templar suppression reveals just how destabilizing Philip's actions really were. Within months of Jacques de Molay's execution, France was experiencing the worst famine in centuries. The royal treasury, despite seizing Templar assets, remained empty because most of that wealth had been tied up in non-liquid investments that couldn't be easily converted to cash. Philip's own nobles began questioning his methods, worried that they might be next if the king decided their wealth was inconvenient. Even more dramatically, the techniques Philip had used against the Templars were turned against his own family within a generation. His daughter-in-law was accused of adultery based on manufactured evidence. His sons died young under mysterious circumstances. His direct royal line ended in 1328, exactly 14 years after de Molay's execution, leading many to believe that the Grand Master's curse had come to pass. But the real curse wasn't supernatural. It was political. Philip had normalized the use of fabricated charges, secret trials, and confiscated property as tools of royal power. He had demonstrated that no institution, no matter how wealthy or well-connected, was safe from a determined monarch with compliant lawyers and cooperative clergy. The precedent he set would echo through European politics for centuries, contributing to the instability that would eventually tear the medieval world apart. Meanwhile, across Europe, the remnants of the Templar organization were adapting to their new reality in ways that would shape the continent's future. Some former Templars joined other military orders and carried their expertise to new theatres of conflict. Others entered royal service as administrators, bankers, and diplomats, bringing Templar organizational methods to secular governments. A few disappeared entirely, possibly founding the secret societies that conspiracy theorists love to discuss. In Portugal, the renamed Order of Christ became the driving force behind the Age of Exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator was a member, and the Order's Red Cross would fly on the sails of Portuguese ships as they opened new trade routes to Africa, and eventually to the Americas. In Scotland, former Templars may have influenced the development of Freemasonry. though the connections are disputed and probably less dramatic than popular culture suggests. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Templar suppression was its impact on the relationship between secular and religious authority in Europe. For 2 centuries, the Templars had represented the possibility that religious organizations could operate independently of royal control. Their destruction marked the beginning of the end for that possibility. The Avignon papacy, which began with Pope Clement's move to France, would last for nearly 70 years and effectively turn the Catholic Church into a department of the French government. When the papacy finally returned to Rome, it was weaker, more divided, and more dependent on secular support than it had been since the early Middle Ages. The great medieval dream of a unified Christian commonwealth under papal leadership was dead, killed partly by Philip's assault on its most powerful military arm. This shift toward royal supremacy over religious institutions would accelerate throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, contributing to the rise of national monarchies and the eventual Protestant Reformation. When Henry VIII of England suppressed the English monasteries 2 centuries later, he was following a playbook that Philip the Fair had written during the destruction of the Templars. The economic consequences were equally profound. The Templar financial network had connected Europe to the broader Mediterranean economy and beyond. With their destruction, European commerce became more localized, more fragmented, and more dependent on royal permission. The economic dynamism that had characterized the High Middle Ages gave way to a more cautious, more regulated commercial environment that would persist until the Renaissance. Yet, even as the institutional Templars disappeared, their legend was just beginning to take shape. Within decades of their suppression, writers across Europe were producing accounts that portrayed them as either martyred heroes or dangerous heretics, depending on the political needs of their patrons. These competing narratives would eventually merge into the complex mythology that surrounds the Templars today. The martyred hero version emphasized their military prowess, their religious devotion, and their unjust persecution by a greedy king and corrupt pope. This narrative appealed to anyone who felt oppressed by royal or ecclesiastical authority, and provided a template for resistance movements throughout European history. The dangerous heretic version focused on their secret rituals, their mysterious knowledge, and their alleged connections to occult practices. This narrative appealed to those who needed to justify the suppression and later influence the development of conspiracy theories about secret societies controlling world events. Neither version was entirely accurate, but both contained enough truth to remain compelling. The Templars had been militarily effective, religiously motivated, and unjustly persecuted. They had also been secretive, politically independent, and potentially threatening to established authority. The gap between these realities created space for legends to flourish. Those legends were further fueled by the mystery of the missing treasure. Despite seizing Templar properties across France, Philip's agents had found far less portable wealth than expected. This discrepancy could be explained by the nature of medieval wealth, which was mostly tied up in land and buildings rather than gold and silver. But it could also be explained by a coordinated effort to move valuable assets before the arrests. The evidence for such an effort is circumstantial but intriguing. The Templar fleet disappeared from La Rochelle shortly before the arrests, and several high-ranking Templars were never captured. There are records of unusual activity at Templar sites in the months leading up to October 1307. Coded messages, nighttime departures, and mysterious cargo shipments. Where might such treasure have gone? The most likely answer is that it was dispersed among friendly institutions and allied organizations across Europe. Some may have reached Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was fighting his war of independence and had been excommunicated by the Pope, making him a natural ally for persecuted Templars. Some may have reached Portugal, where the order was being reformed rather than suppressed. Some may have been hidden in locations known only to trusted members who died without revealing their secrets. But the treasure hunt misses the point of what made the Templars truly dangerous. Their real power wasn't in their gold or silver. It was in their knowledge, their networks, and their organizational methods. These intangible assets couldn't be seized by royal soldiers or inventoried by royal clerks, but they could be preserved and transmitted by surviving members who understood their value. This is why the Templar story doesn't end with Jacques de Molay's execution. It continues through the individuals who carried forward pieces of what the Order had created. The banking techniques, the military innovations, the diplomatic methods, the architectural knowledge, and the organizational principles that had made them so formidable. Some of these individuals are known to history. Others disappeared into new identities and new organizations. But their influence can be traced through the institutions and ideas that shaped Europe's transition from the medieval to the modern world. The Templars didn't just disappear in 1312. They evolved, adapted, and continued to influence events in ways that their enemies never anticipated, and their supporters never fully understood. Now, to really understand what happened to that legendary treasure and why the Templar legacy refused to die, we need to meet some of the people who lived through this catastrophe and shaped what came next. Because while Jacques de Molay was making his final stand in Paris, across Europe other Templars were making very different choices that would determine whether anything of their order would survive. Let me introduce you to Geoffroy de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy, and one of the most interesting figures in this entire saga. Picture this man in October 1307. He's in his 50s, battle-scarred from campaigns in the Holy Land, and he's just watched his entire world collapse in a single morning. Unlike many of his brothers who were caught completely off guard, Geoffroy seems to have sensed what was coming. In the weeks before the arrests, he'd been unusually active, sending coded messages to Templar preceptories across northern France, and meeting secretly with merchants who had long-standing relationships with the Order. When the royal soldiers finally cornered him at the Templar house in Caen, they found something extraordinary. Geoffroy was carrying what appeared to be a burial shroud, ancient and blood-stained, which he claimed had wrapped the body of Christ himself. Now, you might recognize this name, because Geoffroy de Charny was almost certainly related to the family that would later become famous for owning the Shroud of Turin. Coincidence? Possibly. But it's worth noting that this sacred relic, if that's what it was, had somehow made its way from the Templar archives into private hands just as the Order was being destroyed. Geoffroy's fate was sealed when he stood with Jacques de Molay in 1314 and recanted his confession. He burned alongside his Grand Master, but not before he'd arranged for that mysterious shroud to disappear into a network of loyal supporters who would preserve it for future generations. This wasn't just about saving a religious relic. It was about maintaining continuity with the past and preserving symbols that could inspire future resistance. Meanwhile, in England, a very different drama was unfolding around a Templar named William de la Mort, the master of the English Temple. William was a political survivor, the kind of man who understood that sometimes you have to bend to avoid breaking. When King Edward II arrested the English Templars in January 1308, William didn't resist. He didn't confess to heresy, but he also didn't provoke his captors into using the kind of extreme torture that was destroying his brothers in France. Instead, William played a much more sophisticated game. He cooperated with the investigations while quietly working to preserve what could be saved. English records show that throughout the trial period, former Templars continued to receive pensions. Former Templar properties were transferred to other religious orders rather than seized by the crown, and former Templar servants found new employment in royal households. This wasn't accident. This was William de la Mort orchestrating a managed transition that kept his people alive and his organization's knowledge intact. William died in the Tower of London in 1311, officially of natural causes, though some historians suspect poison. But by then he'd accomplished something remarkable. He'd turned the suppression of the English Templars into an absorption rather than a destruction. Many English Templars simply became Hospitallers or joined other military orders. Their expertise wasn't lost, it was transferred. But perhaps the most fascinating figure in this entire story is a man whose very existence challenges everything we think we know about the Templar suppression. Esquire d'Aurillac, the Templar treasurer who was never caught. Picture this. It's September 1307, just weeks before the mass arrests. An esquire is in the vaults beneath the Paris Temple, conducting what appears to be a routine inventory. But something's different this time. Instead of recording assets, he's selecting them. Gold coins minted in different kingdoms, carefully chosen for their ability to blend in anywhere in Europe. Gems that are valuable, but not immediately recognizable as Templar property. Documents written in codes that only a few brothers understand. Esquire wasn't just the treasurer, he was the keeper of the Order's most dangerous secrets. The financial records that showed which kings owed money to the Templars, which nobles had borrowed against future crusades, which merchants had used Templar networks to avoid royal taxes. This information was worth more than gold because it could destroy reputations and topple governments. When the arrests came, Esquire was nowhere to be found. Royal investigators searched every Templar property in France, but he'd vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. Some chronicles suggest he fled to Scotland, others to Portugal, still others to the mysterious East, where the Templars had always maintained shadowy connections. But here's what's really interesting. In the years following the suppression, financial records from across Europe show transactions that bear all the hallmarks of Templar banking methods. Anonymous deposits in Lombard banks, complex currency exchanges that span multiple kingdoms, loans to noble families that are structured exactly like Templar financial instruments. Someone with access to Templar knowledge and Templar resources was still operating, just without the Templar name. Was this Esquire d'Aurillac? We'll never know for certain. But the pattern suggests that the Templar financial network didn't disappear in 1307. It went underground, operating through intermediaries and front organizations, preserving the techniques that had made the Order so powerful, while avoiding the visibility that had made them vulnerable. This underground continuation becomes even more apparent when you look at what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula, where the Templar story took a completely different turn. Here, we need to meet Vasco Fernandes, a Portuguese Templar, who would become instrumental in transforming his order rather than watching it die. Vasco was no ordinary knight. He'd spent decades in the Holy Land, not just fighting, but studying. He spoke Arabic fluently, maintained correspondence with Islamic scholars, and had developed what we might now call a comparative understanding of military technology. When news of the French arrests reached Portugal, Vasco made a decision that would change history. Instead of fleeing or hiding, he approached King Dinis directly with a proposition. The conversation between Vasco Fernandes and King Dinis in the winter of 1307 must have been extraordinary. Here was a Templar knight, supposedly a member of a heretical organization, sitting across from a Christian king and explaining why the Order's suppression was not just unjust, but strategically catastrophic. The Templars, Vasco argued, weren't just warriors for God. They were Europe's memory bank of military innovation, accumulated over 2 centuries of warfare in the most challenging conditions imaginable. Consider what the Templars had learned during their time in the Holy Land. Siege warfare techniques adapted from Byzantine engineers, cavalry tactics borrowed from Turkish horse archers, fortification methods developed through constant conflict with some of the best military minds in the Islamic world. This knowledge didn't belong to France or to the Pope. It belonged to Christendom itself, and destroying it would leave European armies centuries behind their potential enemies. King Dinis was convinced, but he faced a political problem. He couldn't simply ignore papal orders to suppress the Templars. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He would suppress the Knights Templar and simultaneously create the Order of Christ, transferring Templar properties, personnel, and most importantly, knowledge to the new organization. It was the medieval equivalent of a corporate restructuring. Vasco Fernandez became one of the founding members of the Order of Christ, and under his influence, the new organization became something unprecedented. A military order that combined traditional crusading ideals with systematic exploration and expansion. The techniques the Templars had developed for managing far-flung territories and maintaining supply lines across hostile territory were perfect for maritime exploration. This is why Portuguese ships carried the Red Cross of the Order of Christ to Africa, India, and eventually Brazil. The age of exploration wasn't just about finding new trade routes. It was about applying Templar organizational methods to a new kind of expansion, one that would ultimately prove far more successful than the Crusades had ever been. But Vasco's contribution went deeper than just preserving military knowledge. He understood something that most of his contemporaries missed. The Templars' real innovation hadn't been in warfare or finance. It had been in creating systems that could operate across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The same organizational principles that allowed a French knight to work effectively with a Syrian merchant could allow Portuguese explorers to establish trading posts in Africa and Asia. The Order of Christ became a laboratory for testing these principles on a global scale. Portuguese expansion wasn't random exploration. It was systematic application of methods the Templars had developed for managing complexity, diversity, and distance. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, he was using navigation techniques developed by men who had once sailed between European and Middle Eastern ports. When Portuguese traders established their factories in Goa and Macau, they were applying administrative methods first tested in Templar commanderies. Meanwhile, in Scotland, another kind of Templar legacy was taking shape around figures like Sir William St. Clair of Rosslyn. The St. Clair family had been connected to the Templars for generations, providing both financial support and political protection. When the order was suppressed, these connections didn't disappear. They evolved. William St. Clair's response to the Templar crisis reveals a different approach to preserving the order's legacy. Rather than fleeing to distant lands or going underground, he chose to build something permanent. Rosslyn Chapel, one of the most mysterious religious buildings in medieval Europe. Construction began in 1446, more than a century after the Templar suppression. But the chapel's design incorporates symbols, architectural techniques, and decorative elements that seem to echo Templar traditions. What makes Rosslyn Chapel so intriguing isn't its alleged connection to the Holy Grail or other legendary treasures. It's the way it demonstrates how Templar influence could be preserved and transmitted across generations through architecture, symbolism, and craft knowledge. The masons who built Rosslyn weren't necessarily former Templars, but they were working from designs that incorporated techniques and symbols, developed by men who understood how to embed meaning in stone. This architectural preservation of knowledge wasn't unique to Scotland. Across Europe, buildings constructed in the decades following the Templar suppression show similar patterns. Familiar symbols appearing in new contexts, construction techniques that echo Templar methods, decorative programs that seem to reference the order's traditions without explicitly naming them. Take the chapel of Saint-Hubert at Château d'Amboise in France, built in the late 15th century. Officially, it's a royal chapel with no connection to the suppressed Templars, but its design incorporates elements that would have been familiar to anyone trained in Templar architectural traditions. The precise geometric relationships between different sections, the way light is channeled to illuminate specific symbols at certain times of year, the integration of Christian and pre-Christian decorative elements. These weren't accidents or coincidences. They were the work of craftsmen and architects who had learned their trade from masters, who remembered what the Templars had built and how they had built it. Knowledge was being preserved not in written form, which could be seized and destroyed, but in physical form, embedded in buildings that would outlast any political persecution. This preservation through craft guilds and architectural traditions may explain one of the most persistent claims about Templar influence, the connection to Freemasonry. While the direct organizational links are probably much weaker than Masonic legends suggest, the preservation of geometric knowledge, symbolic systems, and construction techniques through craft guilds provides a plausible mechanism for transmitting Templar traditions across centuries. But perhaps the most unexpected place where Templar influence survived was in the Islamic world itself. Here, we encounter figures like Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, a Syrian scholar who had extensive contact with Templars during the final decades of the Crusader presence in the Levant. Ibn Taymiyyah was no friend to the Crusaders, but he was a scholar who recognized valuable knowledge regardless of its source. In his writings, Ibn Taymiyyah describes military and administrative techniques that he attributes to the monk knights of the Franks. Some of these techniques were adopted by Mamluk forces and later by Ottoman armies. The irony is profound. Methods developed by Christian warrior monks to fight Muslim armies were eventually incorporated into Islamic military doctrine and used to expand Muslim power across Europe and Africa. This cross-cultural transmission of knowledge illustrates something crucial about the Templar legacy. It transcended the religious and political boundaries that had originally defined it. The organizational methods, military techniques, and financial innovations developed by the Templars were valuable regardless of the faith or nationality of those who used them. When the order itself was destroyed, its knowledge continued to spread through networks that cared more about effectiveness than about theological purity. The survival and transformation of Templar influence through all these different channels explains why the order's suppression, despite its immediate completeness, failed to achieve its long-term objectives. Philip the Fair had wanted to eliminate a rival power structure and seize its wealth. He succeeded in the short term, but in the long term, he had simply forced that power structure to evolve and adapt. The new forms were often more dangerous than the original because they were less visible and less accountable. Instead of one international organization that operated openly and answered to the Pope, Europe now had multiple networks of former Templars and their allies who operated in secret and answered to no one but themselves. These networks weren't unified or coordinated in the way conspiracy theorists often imagine. They were organic growths that emerged wherever former Templars settled and found ways to apply their knowledge and skills. Some focused on commerce and banking, others concentrated on military innovation and exploration. Still others preserved craft knowledge and symbolic traditions. What united them wasn't a shared command structure or a common political agenda. It was a shared understanding of how to operate effectively in a dangerous and unpredictable world. The Templars had been destroyed because they had become too visible and too threatening to established authority. The lesson their successors learned was simple: stay hidden, stay flexible, and stay useful. This approach proved remarkably successful. By the late 14th century, just a few decades after the Order's official suppression, former Templars and their protégés were playing crucial roles in European politics, commerce, and culture. They weren't trying to recreate the original order. They were building something new and more resilient. The Portuguese Order of Christ was expanding European influence across the globe. Scottish craft guilds were preserving and developing construction techniques that would influence architecture for centuries. Underground banking networks were facilitating trade and communication across political boundaries. Military innovations developed in Templar schools were being applied in new conflicts from the 100 Years' War to the Ottoman expansion. None of these developments were officially connected to the suppressed Templars, which made them almost impossible for authorities to control or eliminate. The very success of Philip's suppression had created the conditions for the Order's transformation into something more powerful and more dangerous than it had ever been as a unified organization. This transformation accelerated throughout the 15th century as Europe entered the Renaissance and began its age of exploration and expansion. The organizational methods, financial techniques, and global perspective that the Templars had developed during their centuries of operation proved perfectly adapted to the challenges of this new era. When Portuguese explorers established trading posts in Africa and Asia, they were applying lessons learned from Templar experience in managing diverse, far-flung territories. When Italian bankers developed new forms of international credit, they were building on techniques originally developed to finance crusading expeditions. When European armies adopted new siege warfare methods, they were often using innovations first tested in the defense of crusader castles. The Renaissance wasn't just a revival of classical learning. It was also, in many ways, a continuation and development of medieval innovations that had been preserved and transmitted through networks that traced their origins back to the suppressed military orders. The Templars hadn't just influenced medieval Europe. They had helped create the foundations of the modern world, but this influence came at a cost that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The survival and transformation of Templar methods had required secrecy, deception, and the manipulation of legitimate institutions for hidden purposes. These techniques were effective, but they also established patterns of behavior that would prove deeply problematic as European society became more complex and interconnected. The habit of operating through front organizations, the practice of embedding agents in legitimate institutions, the use of financial networks to circumvent political authority, these methods had been necessary for survival during the persecution of the early 14th century. But they also created a template for how secret organizations could operate within supposedly transparent societies. By the time European political systems had evolved to the point where such secrecy was no longer necessary for survival, the patterns had become entrenched. Organizations that had originally adopted Templar methods out of necessity continued using them out of habit, creating the kind of hidden influence networks that would fuel conspiracy theories for centuries to come. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Templar story. The methods organizations develop to survive persecution don't disappear when the persecution ends. They become part of the organization's culture, shaping how it operates and how it understands its relationship to the broader society. The Templars were destroyed in 1312. But the organizational culture they had created continued to influence European development long after their official disappearance. Understanding this cultural persistence helps explain why the Templar legend has remained so compelling across 7 centuries. The story touches on something real about how power operates, how knowledge is preserved, and how organizations adapt to hostile environments. The specific claims about hidden treasures and surviving bloodlines may be fantasy, but the underlying insight about organizational survival and transformation reflects genuine historical processes. The men and women who carried forward pieces of the Templar legacy weren't participants in a grand conspiracy. They were individuals trying to preserve valuable knowledge and useful methods in a world that had become suddenly dangerous for anyone associated with the suppressed order. Their success in doing so shaped the development of European civilization in ways that are still visible today, even if the connections are no longer obvious. This is why the Templar story refuses to end with Jacques de Molay's execution. The Order's official suppression was just the beginning of a much longer process of adaptation, evolution, and influence that continued for centuries and arguably continues still. The knights themselves are long dead, but the organizational innovations they pioneered and the cultural patterns they established remain embedded in institutions and practices that shape our world today. Now, to truly understand how these hidden networks operated and why they remain so influential, we need to follow one particular thread that leads us deep into the heart of medieval Europe's power structures. Because while former Templars were adapting and evolving across the continent, something extraordinary was happening in the shadowy world of medieval finance that would reshape European economics for centuries. Meet Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, a man whose name would become synonymous with Renaissance banking and political power. In 1397, just 8 decades after Jacques de Molay's execution, Giovanni established the Medici Bank in Florence. Now, officially, this had nothing to do with the suppressed Templars. Giovanni was simply a clever merchant, capitalizing on opportunities in international trade. But when you examine the banking methods he employed, the organizational structure he created, and the international networks he cultivated, the similarities to Templar financial operations are striking. Giovanni's innovations weren't random discoveries. They were sophisticated applications of techniques that had been developed over centuries of managing money across vast distances and hostile territories. The Medici Bank's ability to facilitate transactions between London and Constantinople, its methods for managing currency exchanges across multiple kingdoms, its systems for extending credit to nobles and merchants throughout Europe, these weren't entirely new inventions. They were refinements of methods that had been tested and perfected by men who understood the practical challenges of international finance better than anyone in medieval Europe. Where had Giovanni learned these techniques? The official records are silent, but the circumstantial evidence is compelling. Florence had been home to numerous merchants and bankers who had worked closely with the Templars before the suppression. The city's financial community had maintained extensive connections with former Templars who had fled France and found refuge in Italian city-states. Knowledge has a way of transferring itself, especially when that knowledge is valuable and the people who possess it need new ways to make a living. The Medici Bank's rise wasn't just about individual genius or favorable market conditions. It was about applying organizational principles that had been developed by the most sophisticated financial institution of the medieval period. The Templars had created the first truly international banking network. And when their organization was destroyed, that knowledge didn't disappear. It dispersed, evolved, and eventually re-emerged in new forms. But Giovanni's story reveals something even more significant about how Templar influence persisted. It wasn't just about preserving old methods, but about adapting them to new circumstances. The Templars had operated openly as a religious military order with papal protection. That model had proven vulnerable to political attack. The new generation of banker merchants who inherited their techniques understood that survival required a different approach. Instead of seeking official recognition and protection, they embedded themselves within existing commercial structures. Instead of claiming religious authority, they built secular networks based on mutual profit and shared risk. Instead of maintaining visible military forces, they exercised power through financial leverage and political influence. The methods were familiar, but the application was revolutionary. This evolution becomes even clearer when we examine what was happening simultaneously in the German states, where another former Templar network was adapting to post-suppression realities. Here, we encounter the remarkable figure of Heinrich von Wurneberg, Archbishop of Cologne from 1304 to 1332. Heinrich presents a fascinating case study in how individuals with Templar connections navigated the dangerous political waters of the early 14th century. Officially, he was simply a prince-bishop managing one of the Holy Roman Empire's most important ecclesiastical territories. Unofficially, he was coordinating what can only be described as a protection and integration program for displaced Templars throughout the German-speaking regions. The evidence lies in Heinrich's administrative records, which show an unusual pattern of appointments and land grants in the years following 1307. Former Templars, who should have been persona non grata in ecclesiastical circles, were quietly absorbed into the administrative apparatus of the Cologne Archbishopric. Their military experience was redirected toward managing the Archbishop's temporal territories. Their financial expertise was applied to reorganizing church revenues. Their international connections were used to strengthen diplomatic relationships with other German princes. Heinrich's approach was brilliant in its subtlety. He never openly defied papal orders regarding the Templar suppression, but he interpreted those orders in the narrowest possible way. The Pope had ordered the dissolution of the Knights Templar as an organization. He hadn't forbidden individual former Templars from finding new employment or applying their skills in different contexts. Heinrich exploited this distinction to preserve much of what the order had represented, while avoiding the political dangers of open resistance. The results were remarkable. Under Heinrich's administration, the Cologne Archbishopric became one of the most efficiently managed territories in the Holy Roman Empire. Its military forces were reorganized using tactics developed during decades of warfare in the Holy Land. Its financial administration adopted accounting methods that allowed for unprecedented control over revenues and expenditures. Its diplomatic corps maintained contacts throughout Europe that provided early warning of political developments affecting German interests. More importantly, Heinrich's territory became a training ground for a new generation of administrators, diplomats, and military leaders who combined traditional German political skills with organizational methods learned from former Templars. These individuals would go on to serve other German princes, carrying with them techniques and perspectives that would influence the development of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. The pattern Heinrich established was replicated throughout the German states. Prince-bishops, secular rulers, and even some abbots quietly integrated former Templars into their administrations. The knowledge and skills that had made the order so formidable weren't lost. They were distributed throughout the German political system, strengthening individual territories while avoiding the vulnerabilities that had destroyed the unified organization. This dispersal strategy proved remarkably effective. When the Holy Roman Empire faced new challenges from Ottoman expansion, French aggression, and internal religious conflicts, it had access to military and administrative expertise that had been preserved and adapted from the crusading period. The tactical innovations developed in the defense of Outremer were applied to the defense of Vienna. The organizational methods tested in managing far-flung Templar properties were used to coordinate resistance across multiple German states. But perhaps the most intriguing example of Templar legacy adaptation occurred in a place where few people would think to look: the merchant republics of northern Italy, particularly Venice. Here, we encounter the shadowy figure of Marco Sanudo, who in 1207 had established the Duchy of Naxos in the Aegean Sea as a crusader state that lasted for over 3 centuries. The Sanudo family's connection to the Templars was complex and largely hidden from official records, but their methods of managing their island duchy reveal striking similarities to Templar administrative techniques. They maintained a delicate balance between Christian and Islamic populations, facilitated trade between European and Middle Eastern merchants, and preserved their independence through a combination of military preparedness and diplomatic flexibility. When the Templar suppression occurred, the Sanudos faced a dilemma similar to that confronted by former Templars throughout Europe: how to preserve valuable organizational knowledge while avoiding political persecution. Their solution was to gradually transition from a traditional crusader state model to something that more closely resembled a commercial trading empire. The transformation was subtle but profound. The Duchy of Naxos maintained its Christian identity and its nominal allegiance to Western European powers, but it increasingly operated according to principles that prioritized economic efficiency and political pragmatism over religious ideology. The result was a hybrid institution that combined elements of Crusader military organization, Templar administrative methods, and Venetian commercial practices. This hybrid model proved remarkably durable. While other Crusader states fell to Islamic reconquest or internal collapse, the Duchy of Naxos survived until 1566, more than 2 centuries after the fall of Constantinople. Its longevity wasn't due to military strength or divine protection. It was due to organizational flexibility and the intelligent application of lessons learned from both Templar successes and Templar failures. The Sanudo approach influenced Venetian policy throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Venice itself began adopting administrative and military techniques that bore clear similarities to Templar methods, though the connections were never officially acknowledged. Venetian trade networks, Venetian diplomatic practices, and Venetian colonial administration all showed the influence of organizational principles that could be traced back to the suppressed military orders. This influence becomes particularly apparent when examining Venetian activities in the Black Sea region, where the Republic established trading posts and diplomatic relationships that closely resembled the network of contacts the Templars had maintained throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The same practical approach to cross-cultural relationships, the same emphasis on long-term strategic positioning, the same ability to operate effectively in hostile or uncertain political environments. But the most dramatic example of Templar legacy preservation occurred in a place that might seem completely unrelated to European medieval politics: the emerging Ottoman Empire. Here, we encounter one of history's most unlikely cultural transfers, mediated by figures who understood that valuable knowledge transcends religious and political boundaries. Consider the career of Halil Pasha, one of the early Ottoman Grand Viziers who played a crucial role in consolidating Ottoman power in southeastern Europe during the late 14th century. Halil's background was complex. He had been born into a Byzantine Greek family, converted to Islam as a young man, and risen through the Ottoman administrative hierarchy through a combination of intelligence, adaptability, and organizational skill. What makes Halil particularly interesting is that his administrative methods bore striking similarities to techniques that had been developed by European military orders, including the Templars. His approach to managing conquered territories, his systems for integrating diverse populations into the Ottoman state, his methods for maintaining military preparedness while encouraging economic development, these weren't typically Islamic or typically Byzantine approaches. They were hybrid techniques that seemed to draw from multiple traditions. How had Halil acquired this knowledge? The answer lies in the complex web of cultural exchange that characterized the Eastern Mediterranean during the 14th century. Former Templars, former Hospitallers, Byzantine administrators, Genoese merchants, and Venetian diplomats all operated in the same geographical and political space. Knowledge transferred between communities through marriage, employment, military service, and simple professional interaction. Halil's career illustrates how organizational innovations developed in one context could be adapted and applied in completely different circumstances. The techniques that had made the Templars effective at managing diverse populations in Crusader states proved equally valuable for managing diverse populations in Ottoman provinces. The financial methods that had allowed military orders to coordinate activities across vast distances worked just as well for coordinating Ottoman administration across multiple continents. This cross-cultural transfer of knowledge wasn't unique to Halil or to the Ottoman Empire. Similar processes were occurring throughout the Mediterranean world as political boundaries shifted and established institutions adapted to new circumstances. Former Templars found employment with Mamluk sultans in Egypt. Byzantine administrators adopted Western European organizational methods. Islamic scholars studied European military treatises. European merchants learned Islamic commercial practices. The result was a gradual but profound transformation of how political and military institutions operated throughout the region. The rigid religious and cultural boundaries that had characterized the crusading period gave way to more fluid and pragmatic approaches that emphasized effectiveness over ideological purity. Organizations that could adapt and learn survived. Those that couldn't disappeared. This transformation had profound implications for European development. The techniques and perspectives that had been developed during centuries of interaction between Christian and Islamic civilizations didn't disappear when the Crusader states fell. They were preserved, adapted, and eventually reintroduced to European society through the networks of merchants, diplomats, and administrators who maintained contacts across cultural boundaries. The Renaissance wasn't just a rediscovery of classical antiquity. It was also a reintegration of knowledge and methods that had been developed during the medieval period of cultural exchange. The organizational innovations of the military orders, the commercial techniques of Mediterranean merchants, the diplomatic practices of cosmopolitan administrators, all of these contributed to the intellectual and practical foundations of early modern European civilization. But this process of knowledge transfer and adaptation also created new forms of hidden influence that would shape European politics for centuries. The networks that preserved and transmitted Templar organizational methods weren't just preserving technical knowledge. They were also preserving patterns of behavior, institutional cultures, and ways of thinking about power and authority that had been developed during the medieval period. These cultural patterns proved remarkably persistent. Long after the specific techniques had been forgotten or superseded, the underlying approaches to organization, secrecy, and influence continued to shape how certain groups operated within European society. The habit of maintaining parallel structures, the practice of operating through intermediaries, the preference for indirect influence over direct confrontation. These became embedded characteristics of institutions and networks that trace their origins back to the survival strategies developed during the Templar suppression. The long-term consequences of this cultural persistence become apparent when we examine the development of early modern European politics. The rise of absolutist monarchies, the emergence of professional diplomatic services, the development of standing armies, the creation of national banking systems. All of these reflected the influence of organizational principles that had been developed and refined by medieval institutions, including the suppressed military orders. But the influence wasn't always positive. The same techniques that had allowed valuable knowledge to survive persecution could also be used to avoid accountability and manipulate legitimate institutions for hidden purposes. The networks that preserved Templar methods also established precedents for how secret organizations could operate within supposedly transparent societies. This dual legacy, preservation of valuable knowledge combined with the creation of hidden influence networks, explains much about the subsequent development of European civilization. The positive contributions are often invisible because they became so thoroughly integrated into mainstream institutions that their origins were forgotten. The negative consequences are often exaggerated because they feed into conspiracy theories and popular suspicions about secret societies. Understanding this dual legacy requires recognizing that the Templar suppression wasn't just a single historical event. It was the beginning of a long process of adaptation and evolution that continued for centuries and influenced the development of European institutions in ways that are still visible today. The men who died on Philip the Fair's pyres weren't the end of the story. They were catalysts for transformations that would reshape the Western world. The networks that emerged from the wreckage of the temple weren't trying to recreate the original organization. They were building something new and more resilient, something that could survive in a world where religious authority was becoming subordinate to political power and where traditional institutions were increasingly vulnerable to royal manipulation. Their success in doing so created the foundations for many of the organizational innovations that would define the early modern period. The joint stock companies that financed European expansion, the diplomatic corps that managed international relations, the banking houses that facilitated global trade, the craft guilds that preserved and transmitted technical knowledge. All of these owed debts to organizational principles that had been developed and refined by medieval military orders. But perhaps most importantly, the networks that preserved Templar methods also preserved a particular way of thinking about organization and authority that emphasized competence over birth, merit over tradition, and practical effectiveness over ideological purity. These values weren't unique to the Templars, but the order's suppression created conditions where they could be transmitted and developed by people who understood their importance for survival in a hostile world. The men and women who carried forward this legacy weren't conspirators plotting to control world events. They were pragmatists trying to preserve valuable knowledge and useful methods in a world that had become suddenly dangerous for anyone associated with innovative or independent institutions. Their success in doing so helped create the intellectual and organizational foundations of modern European civilization. This is why the Templar story continues to fascinate people 7 centuries after the Order's suppression. It's not just about medieval knights or hidden treasures. It's about how knowledge survives, how institutions adapt, and how cultural patterns persist across generations. The specific details may be debated by historians, but the underlying processes reflect fundamental truths about how human societies preserve and transmit the innovations that allow them to survive and prosper. The legacy of the Knights Templar isn't hidden in some secret vault or encoded in mysterious symbols. It's embedded in the institutional structures, organizational methods, and cultural assumptions that shape our world today. Understanding that legacy requires looking beyond the legends and conspiracy theories to see how the real innovations of a remarkable medieval institution continue to influence human development long after the institution itself had disappeared. As we move deeper into their final chapters, we'll discover that the most important Templar secrets weren't about hidden gold or sacred relics. They were about how to organize human activity effectively, how to preserve knowledge across generations, and how to adapt to changing circumstances without losing essential capabilities. These secrets weren't hidden by design. They were hidden by time, integrated so thoroughly into subsequent developments that their origins became invisible. But the traces remain, waiting to be discovered by anyone willing to look beyond the surface of historical events to see the deeper patterns of cultural transmission and institutional evolution. The Knights Templar didn't just disappear in 1312. They transformed, evolved, and continued to influence the development of Western civilization in ways that their enemies never anticipated and their supporters never fully understood. The real treasure of the Templars wasn't gold or silver. It was knowledge, organizational knowledge, technical knowledge, cultural knowledge, that proved more valuable than any material wealth because it could be preserved, transmitted, and continuously adapted to new circumstances. That treasure wasn't lost when the order was suppressed. It was distributed, hidden in plain sight within the institutions and practices that emerged from the wreckage of medieval Christendom. And that treasure continues to shape our world today, embedded in systems and structures that we take for granted, but that represent the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who understood how to organize human activity for maximum effectiveness. The Knights Templar are gone, but their most important contributions to human civilization live on, disguised as the normal operations of the modern world. Now, to understand how this hidden treasure actually moved and where it ended up, we need to follow the most dangerous man in 14th century Europe. A Templar you've never heard of whose actions changed the course of history. His name was Bertrand de Blanchefort, and on the night of October 12th, 1307, he made a decision that would echo through centuries. Picture this scene. It's past midnight in the port city of La Rochelle, and the docks are alive with activity that shouldn't be happening. Men move silently between warehouses, loading heavy chests onto ships that should be anchored for the night. These aren't ordinary merchants or typical cargo. These are Templars, and they're racing against time. Bertrand stands on the dock, watching as the last of the treasure chest disappears into the hold of a Templar galley. He's the Order's maritime commander for Atlantic operations, a position that officially doesn't exist, but practically controls a fleet of 18 ships operating between England, France, and the Iberian Peninsula. Unlike his brothers sleeping peacefully in commanderies across France, Bertrand knows what's coming. The question isn't whether Philip will strike, but when. The intelligence had reached him 3 days earlier through a network that the French king never suspected existed. The Order's commercial contacts, a Lombard banker in Paris, a wool merchant in Flanders, a spice trader in Marseille. These men owed their prosperity to Templar financial backing, and they repaid that debt with information. Philip's secret orders were being distributed. The date was set. The trap was about to spring. But here's what makes Bertrand's story so crucial. He wasn't just evacuating treasure. He was implementing a contingency plan that had been decades in the making. The Templars hadn't survived 2 centuries of warfare and political intrigue by being naive about human nature. They understood that even popes could be corrupted, and even kings could be bought. What they had created wasn't just an organization. It was a system designed to survive its own destruction. The ships leaving La Rochelle that night weren't heading to random destinations. They were following predetermined routes to carefully chosen havens, where Templar agents had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. Some headed north to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was fighting for independence and needed both money and military expertise. Others sailed west to Ireland, where Templar properties could be quickly transferred to allied Irish clans. Still others headed south to Portugal, where King Dinis had already indicated his intention to protect rather than persecute the order. But the most intriguing cargo went east, toward the Baltic Sea and the mysterious trading networks that connected Northern Europe to Russia and beyond. Because what most people don't realize about the Templars is that their operations extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Christendom. They had agents in Novgorod, contacts in Kiev, and trading relationships that stretched all the way to Constantinople and beyond. Bertrand himself chose the most dangerous route. Directly to Cyprus, the Order's eastern headquarters and the last major Templar stronghold in the Mediterranean. His ship, the St. Bernard, was one of the fastest vessels in the Templar fleet, but the journey would take him through waters controlled by hostile forces and into ports where Philip's agents were already spreading their poison. The voyage that followed reads like something from an adventure novel, except it was real, and the stakes were the survival of 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge and wealth. Bertrand's ship was pursued by French naval vessels, attacked by pirates who had been promised rewards for Templar captures, and forced to navigate political obstacles at every port of call. The first challenge came at Gibraltar, where Spanish authorities had received conflicting orders from their king. Officially, they were supposed to arrest any Templars attempting to flee French justice. Unofficially, they understood that Spain's own Templar communities were too valuable to sacrifice to Philip's ambitions. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Spanish officials delayed processing the French arrest warrants just long enough for Bertrand's ship to disappear into the Mediterranean. The next obstacle was more serious: a Genoese war galley that had been specifically dispatched to intercept Templar vessels. The Genoese weren't acting out of religious conviction or loyalty to France. They were motivated by something much simpler: greed. Philip had promised substantial rewards for any Templar treasure that could be seized, and Genoese merchants were never ones to pass up profitable opportunities. The naval battle that followed was brief but decisive. Templar ships weren't designed primarily for warfare, but they were crewed by men who had learned seamanship in some of the most dangerous waters in the world. More importantly, they were fighting for something more valuable than money: the preservation of everything their order represented. Bertrand's tactical decision during this engagement reveals the kind of thinking that had made the Templars so formidable. Instead of trying to outfight a superior force, he outthought them. The St. Bernard carried 2 types of cargo: genuine Templar treasure and carefully prepared decoys. When the Genoese galley closed for boarding, Bertrand ordered the decoy chests thrown overboard in full view of the enemy crew. The Genoese captain faced an immediate choice: continue pursuing a ship that might contain more treasure, or stop to recover the chests that were definitely sinking toward the Mediterranean floor. Greed won, as Bertrand had calculated it would. While the Genoese sailors dove for treasure chests filled with lead weights and worthless trinkets, the St. Bernard disappeared over the horizon carrying the real prize. But the most remarkable part of Bertrand's journey wasn't the naval combat or the clever deceptions. It was what happened when he finally reached Cyprus and delivered his cargo to Jacques de Molay himself. Because the Grand Master's reaction to the treasure delivery reveals something crucial about what the Templars were really trying to preserve. Picture this scene. It's November 1307, and Bertrand stands in the great hall of the Templar fortress at Limassol, exhausted from weeks of dangerous travel. Before him are chests containing gold, silver, precious stones, and documents that represent 2 centuries of accumulated wealth and knowledge. Any normal military commander would have been delighted to receive such resources, especially with the order under attack throughout Europe. But Jacques de Molay barely glanced at the treasure. Instead, he focused entirely on a single leather satchel that contained something far more valuable than gold: the master copies of the Templar rule, their initiation rituals, their financial records, and most importantly, their lists of contacts and allies throughout Europe and the Middle East. This is the moment when we begin to understand what the Templar treasure really was. The gold and silver were useful, but they were replaceable. the knowledge contained in those documents was irreplaceable. It represented relationships that had taken decades to build, secrets that had been centuries in the gathering, and organizational methods that had been tested and refined through constant use. Jacques de Molay understood something that Philip the Fair never grasped. The real power of the Templars didn't come from their wealth. It came from their knowledge of how to operate effectively in a complex, dangerous, and constantly changing world. That knowledge couldn't be seized by royal soldiers or confiscated by papal decree. It could only be preserved and transmitted by people who understood its value. The Grand Master's next decision was one of the most important in medieval history, though its significance wouldn't become apparent for centuries. Instead of trying to use the treasure to finance military resistance or political bribery, he ordered it to be dispersed according to a predetermined plan that would ensure the survival of Templar knowledge even if the organization itself was destroyed. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its long-term consequences. Different portions of the treasure would be entrusted to different networks of allies, each operating independently and each capable of preserving and transmitting specific aspects of Templar expertise. No single group would have access to everything, which meant that no single betrayal or disaster could destroy the entire legacy. The largest portion went to the Portuguese contacts, where it would help finance the transformation of the Templars into the Order of Christ and ultimately contribute to the Age of Exploration. Another portion went to Scottish allies, where it would help finance Robert the Bruce's War of Independence and possibly influence the development of Masonic traditions. A third portion went to Italian banking houses, where it would help finance the Renaissance and the development of modern commercial practices. But perhaps the most intriguing portion went to a destination that has never been definitively identified. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, possibly Poland or Hungary, where Templar agents had established connections with emerging kingdoms that were beginning to challenge both Islamic expansion and Western European domination. The man chosen to carry this Eastern treasure was a Polish Templar named Władysław the Silent, whose very existence challenges conventional understanding of how far Templar influence had spread. Władysław had spent decades operating in the borderlands between Christianity and Islam, between Western and Eastern Europe, between established kingdoms and emerging principalities. He spoke 6 languages, maintained contacts in a dozen courts, and understood the political dynamics of regions that most Western Europeans couldn't even locate on a map. Władysław's mission was perhaps the most ambitious of all the treasure dispersals. He was supposed to use Templar resources to influence the development of Eastern European kingdoms in ways that would create long-term allies for Western Christendom, while preserving Templar organizational methods for future use. The journey that followed took Władysław through some of the most contested territory in medieval Europe. He traveled through the Balkans, where Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms were struggling to maintain independence against both Byzantine and Ottoman pressure. He passed through Hungary, where the royal court was trying to balance competing pressures from the Holy Roman Empire, France, and the emerging Ottoman threat. He ultimately reached Poland, where a dynamic new kingdom was beginning to emerge as a major power in Central Europe. What Władysław accomplished in Poland illustrates how Templar influence could operate through completely legitimate channels while remaining essentially hidden. Using his treasure as capital, he established what appeared to be a normal commercial enterprise, a trading company that facilitated commerce between Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the emerging Russian principalities. But this trading company operated according to organizational principles that had been developed by the Templars over centuries of managing complex international operations. It maintained detailed intelligence about political developments throughout its operational area. It provided financial services that allowed merchants and nobles to conduct business across vast distances. It offered protection services for travelers and valuable cargo, and it gradually became indispensable to the Polish royal court, which came to depend on its services for everything from diplomatic communication to military intelligence. Within a generation, former Templars and their Polish protégés were playing crucial roles in Polish politics, military organization, and economic development. They weren't operating as a secret society or a hidden conspiracy. They were functioning as a normal part of Polish institutional life, applying methods and knowledge that happened to have been developed by a suppressed military order. The results were remarkable. Poland became one of the most effectively organized kingdoms in Eastern Europe, with military forces that could compete with Western European armies, financial systems that could support large-scale political and military operations, and diplomatic services that could maintain relationships throughout the known world. When Poland later became a major European power, the organizational foundations of that success could be traced back to innovations that had originally been developed by the Knights Templar. But Władysław's story also illustrates the complexity of Templar legacy preservation. He wasn't trying to recreate the original order or to maintain its religious mission. He was adapting Templar methods to serve Polish interests and Polish goals. The knowledge was preserved, but it was also transformed, integrated into a different cultural and political context where it could continue to evolve and develop. This process of adaptive preservation was occurring simultaneously throughout Europe as other treasure carriers completed their missions and established their own networks of influence. Each group faced different challenges and opportunities, which meant that Templar methods evolved in different directions depending on local circumstances. In Scotland, the treasure that arrived with fleeing Templars helped finance not just military resistance, but also the development of craft guilds that would preserve and transmit construction techniques, mathematical knowledge, and symbolic systems for centuries. The famous Rosslyn Chapel, built more than a century after the Templar suppression, demonstrates how this knowledge could be embedded in physical structures that would outlast any political persecution. In Portugal, Templar resources were integrated into a systematic program of maritime exploration that would ultimately reshape the global balance of power. The navigational techniques, ship design innovations, and organizational methods that enabled Portuguese expansion all showed clear influences from Templar precedents, though the connections were never officially acknowledged. In Italy, Templar treasure helped capitalize banking houses that would finance the Renaissance and develop the commercial techniques that would define early modern European economics. The Medici Bank, the Fugger financial empire, and other major commercial enterprises all showed organizational characteristics that could be traced back to Templar innovations, though again, the connections were carefully concealed. But perhaps the most successful adaptation occurred in the most unexpected place. Within the Islamic world itself, where former Templars found employment with rulers who valued their military and administrative expertise more than their religious background. Consider the remarkable career of a man known in Arabic sources as Abu Yusuf al-Faranj, the Frank. European sources suggest he was originally Pierre de Montfort, a Templar knight who had been serving in Cyprus when the order was suppressed. Rather than fleeing to Christian lands, Pierre chose to offer his services to the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, who was engaged in consolidating control over territories recently conquered from the Crusaders. The Sultan's decision to employ a former Crusader might seem surprising, but it reflects a practical understanding that valuable expertise transcends religious boundaries. Pierre brought knowledge of European military techniques, understanding of Crusader castle design and siege warfare, and most importantly, intimate familiarity with the organizational methods that had made the military orders so effective. Under the name Abu Yusuf, Pierre helped reorganize Mamluk military administration, introduced new training methods for cavalry forces, and assisted in the design of fortifications that incorporated both Islamic and European innovations. His influence can be traced in Mamluk military manuals, architectural projects, and administrative reforms that strengthened the Sultanate's ability to resist both Mongol invasions and future Crusader attempts. But Abu Yusuf's most significant contribution was less visible and more long-lasting. He helped establish training programs that preserved and transmitted military knowledge across generations. The methods he developed for educating Mamluk officers incorporated organizational principles that had been developed by European military orders, adapted to Islamic cultural and religious contexts. These training programs produced officers who understood not just tactics and strategy, but also logistics, administration, and the complex coordination required for large-scale military operations. When the Ottoman Empire later conquered Mamluk territories, many of these officers entered Ottoman service, carrying with them knowledge and methods that would influence Ottoman military organization for centuries. The irony is profound. Techniques developed by Christian warrior monks to fight Islamic armies were eventually integrated into Islamic military doctrine and used to expand Islamic power throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. Knowledge truly has no nationality or religion. It belongs to whoever understands its value and knows how to apply it effectively. This cross-cultural transmission of Templar methods illustrates something crucial about why the Order's legacy proved so durable and so influential. The organizational innovations they had developed weren't tied to any particular religious or political system. They were universal principles of effective administration, applicable wherever human beings needed to coordinate complex activities across time and distance. When the Templars were suppressed as a Christian military order, their methods survived and spread precisely because those methods had value that transcended the specific context in which they had been developed. Former Templars could find employment with Islamic rulers, Polish kings, Italian bankers, or Scottish nobles because they possessed knowledge that was useful regardless of the employer's faith or nationality. This universality of Templar organizational methods helps explain why conspiracy theorists have always been fascinated by the Order's supposed continued existence. The reality is both simpler and more complex than any conspiracy theory suggests. The Templars didn't survive as a secret organization. They survived as a set of ideas, techniques, and cultural patterns that proved useful to many different groups in many different contexts. But these survival patterns also created something that looked very much like a conspiracy to anyone who didn't understand what was really happening. Former Templars and their protégés did maintain contacts across political and religious boundaries. They did share information and coordinate activities. They did exercise influence that was disproportionate to their official positions. And they did pass on knowledge and methods that gave them advantages over competitors who lacked access to such expertise. The difference between this reality and the conspiracy theories is that there was no central coordination, no unified agenda, and no secret masters pulling strings behind the scenes. What existed was a network of individuals and groups who shared common knowledge and similar approaches to organization and problem solving. They helped each other when possible, but they weren't working toward any grand plan or ultimate objective. This distinction is crucial for understanding how Templar influence actually operated in the centuries following the suppression. The former Templars and their successors weren't trying to control world events or establish a new world order. They were trying to survive, prosper, and apply their knowledge in new contexts. Their success in doing so created patterns of influence and organization that shaped European development. But those patterns emerged organically, rather than being imposed by design. The treasure that left La Rochelle in October 1307 wasn't just gold and silver. It was seed capital for innovations that would transform European civilization. The men who carried that treasure weren't just preserving wealth. They were planting ideas and methods that would grow and develop in ways that none of them could have anticipated. By the late 14th century, less than 100 years after the Templar suppression, these seeds had grown into institutions and practices that were reshaping European politics, economics, and culture. The Renaissance banking houses that financed artistic and intellectual innovation, the exploration companies that opened new worlds, the military reforms that created modern armies, the diplomatic services that managed international relations. All of these showed clear influences from organizational methods that had been developed by the suppressed military orders. But the influence wasn't just institutional, it was also cultural and intellectual. The Templar experience had demonstrated that effective organization required certain approaches to leadership, communication, financial management, and strategic planning. These approaches became embedded in European culture through the networks of people who had learned them from former Templars or their protégés. The result was a gradual but profound transformation in how Europeans thought about organization, authority, and effectiveness. Medieval European society had traditionally emphasized birth, tradition, and religious authority as the bases of power and legitimacy. The post-Templar world increasingly emphasized competence, innovation, and practical results. This cultural shift wasn't immediate or universal, but it was persistent and ultimately decisive. By the time of the Renaissance, European society had developed institutional structures and cultural values that were fundamentally different from those that had existed during the High Middle Ages. The change wasn't just about technology or economics. It was about how human beings organized themselves to achieve complex objectives. The Knights Templar had contributed to this transformation, not through any grand design or secret conspiracy, but simply by developing and demonstrating more effective ways of managing complex organizations. When their order was suppressed, those methods didn't disappear. They spread, evolved, and eventually became part of the standard toolkit for anyone trying to organize large-scale human activities. This is perhaps the most important aspect of the Templar legacy. They had helped create new standards of organizational effectiveness that raised expectations for what institutions could accomplish. Once people had seen what was possible with proper planning, coordination, and management, they were less willing to accept the inefficiencies and limitations of traditional medieval institutions. The treasure that disappeared from Templar strongholds in 1307 wasn't hidden in some secret vault waiting to be discovered. It was invested in innovations that became so successful and so widespread that their origins were forgotten. The real Templar treasure became the institutional foundations of the modern world. But as we approach the final chapters of this story, we need to confront the most disturbing aspect of the Templar legacy: the precedent their suppression set for how powerful institutions could be destroyed through manufactured scandal and political manipulation. Because while former Templars were adapting and innovating throughout Europe, the techniques Philip the Fair had used against them were also spreading and evolving. The destruction of the Knights Templar wasn't just about eliminating a rival power structure or seizing valuable assets. It was about demonstrating new methods of political control that would reshape European statecraft for centuries. Philip had shown that even the most powerful religious organization could be brought down through a combination of secret preparation, coordinated propaganda, and legal manipulation. Other rulers took note, and the lessons they learned would echo through European history with devastating consequences. The techniques Philip pioneered would be used against other religious orders, against merchant guilds, against noble families, and eventually against entire populations that inconvenient rulers wanted to eliminate or control. The Spanish Inquisition, the dissolution of English monasteries, the persecution of religious minorities throughout Europe. All of these would follow patterns established during the Templar trials. The specific targets changed, but the methods remained remarkably consistent. Secret preparation, manufactured evidence, coordinated arrests, show trials, and property confiscation. Even more disturbing, these techniques would eventually be applied on scales that Philip could never have imagined. The totalitarian movements of the 20th century used methods of social control and population manipulation that were direct descendants of innovations first tested during the destruction of the Knights Templar. This darker aspect of the Templar legacy reminds us that historical innovations can have unintended consequences that persist for centuries. Philip the Fair thought he was solving a short-term political problem. Instead, he was creating precedents that would influence European politics for generations. The same organizational methods that allowed former Templars to preserve valuable knowledge and contribute to positive developments could also be used by less scrupulous individuals and groups for manipulation, control, and exploitation. The techniques were morally neutral, but their applications were not. Understanding this dual legacy is crucial for making sense of why the Templar story continues to resonate in popular culture and political discourse. The order represents both the promise and the danger of sophisticated organization. They demonstrated what could be accomplished with proper planning, coordination, and management. But their destruction also demonstrated how such capabilities could be turned to destructive purposes by those who understood their power. As we move toward the conclusion of this remarkable story, we'll discover that the most important Templar secrets weren't about gold or mystical knowledge. They were about how human societies organized themselves for both creation and destruction, and how the same capabilities that enable great achievements can also enable great catastrophes. The men who died on Philip's pyres 7 centuries ago couldn't have imagined how their legacy would unfold. They thought they were fighting for their faith and their honor. Instead, they were participants in transformations that would reshape human civilization itself. Their story isn't just medieval history. It's a preview of the modern world, with all its promise and all its peril. The treasure they tried to save wasn't just preserved, it multiplied, evolved, and became part of the foundations of everything we recognize as modern institutional life. But the methods used to destroy them also multiplied and evolved, creating capabilities for social control that their medieval persecutors could never have imagined. Both legacies persist today, embedded in institutions and practices that we take for granted, but that represent the accumulated wisdom and folly of generations of human experience. The Knights Templar are gone, but the forces they represented and the forces that destroyed them continue to shape our world in ways that we're only beginning to understand. The real question isn't what happened to the Templar treasure, it's what happened to the people who knew where it went. Because in the decades following 1307, a pattern emerges across Europe that's far more intriguing than any hidden gold. Individuals with suspiciously advanced knowledge appearing in positions of influence, transforming institutions from within using methods that shouldn't have existed yet. Take the case of Master Thomas of London, a man whose very existence challenges everything we think we know about medieval craft guilds. In 1315, just 8 years after the Templar suppression, Thomas appeared in London's records as the newly appointed Master of the Masons Guild. Officially, he was simply a skilled craftsman who had earned his position through years of dedicated work. But Thomas's first project reveals something extraordinary. Picture this. King Edward II has just commissioned the rebuilding of a section of the Tower of London that was damaged during recent political upheavals. It's a standard royal construction project, the kind that typically takes years of planning and even more years of execution. Medieval construction was slow, expensive, and frequently plagued by cost overruns that could bankrupt even wealthy patrons. But Thomas's approach was revolutionary. He organized the project using management techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized until centuries later. He divided the work into specialized teams, each responsible for specific aspects of construction. He established quality control procedures that ensured consistent standards across all phases of the project. Most remarkably, he implemented a logistics system that coordinated the delivery of materials, the scheduling of workers, and the sequencing of construction phases with mathematical precision. The result was unprecedented. The project was completed ahead of schedule, under budget, and to specifications that exceeded anything previously achieved in English construction. Other guilds took notice. Within a decade, Master Thomas's methods were being copied throughout London's craft communities, transforming how major construction projects were managed across England. But here's what makes Thomas's story so compelling. When investigators later tried to trace his background, they found gaps. He claimed to have trained in France, but the French guilds he named had no record of him. He demonstrated familiarity with construction techniques used in the Holy Land, but he had no documented military service. Most puzzling of all, he possessed architectural drawings that showed construction methods used in Crusader castles, drawings that should have been impossible for an ordinary English mason to obtain. Thomas wasn't unique. Similar figures were appearing throughout Europe, always at moments of institutional transformation, always bringing knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere. In Florence, a banker named Lorenzo di Benedetto revolutionized Italian commercial practices using accounting methods that bore striking similarities to Templar financial techniques. In Prague, a military engineer named Hans the Builder redesigned the city's fortifications using principles that had been developed during centuries of warfare in Outremer. These men shared certain characteristics. They appeared suddenly in historical records. They possessed knowledge that was advanced for their time and place. They transformed the institutions they joined, and they maintained connections across political and religious boundaries that shouldn't have existed for people of their supposed backgrounds. What we're seeing is the human face of Templar legacy preservation. These weren't secret agents operating according to some master plan. They were individuals who had learned valuable skills and knowledge, often through connections to former Templars, and who were applying that knowledge in new contexts where it could make a real difference. But the most remarkable example of this pattern occurred in a place where Templar influence should have been impossible: the court of the Mongol Khan in far-off Karakorum. Here we encounter Guillaume de Rubruck, officially a Franciscan missionary, but actually something